For a long time, I've been interested in that issue, and I've learned over the years that it's very, very difficult to get good information about what's really going on in that part of the world. So when I saw a film of Dr. Ashmore presenting his paper not very long ago to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I realized that this was such important information that he really needed to bring it to a Dallas audience so that we can hear more first-hand information about what's going on. And a little bit about Dr. Ashmore. He is Professor Emeritus at Marquette University, where he began teaching in 1969. He's a native of Dallas, received his PhD from Notre Dame. And since 1982, that was 33 years ago, he's been active in human rights issues related to Middle East conflicts. He has had first-hand experience of that part of the world over that span of time, where he's traveled to the West Bank, Gaza, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Tunisia, and Egypt. He has even taught in Gaza as part of Marquette's outreach program and serves on the National Advisory Board of the Middle East Policy Council. As the director of Marquette's Center for Ethics Studies, he's received 2 successive grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and is a recipient of Marquette's Faculty Award for Teaching Excellence. His teaching and publications include human rights, ethical theory, philosophy of law, and business ethics, and he's active in both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. He's a very, very busy man. He continues to write and lecture, so we're very, very lucky to have him here today. And if you're interested in knowing more about him, Google his name, and you'll find a bio that's about that long. Very impressive, so thank you all for being with us tonight. And if I made any mistakes, please correct them.
Not yet. Thank you, Joyce. I express appreciation, of course, to all the folks here at North Haven for inviting me, and I look forward to the Q&A that follows my presentation, because I'm a university professor and I have always taught by interaction with my students, not by lecturing. So I will feel somewhat uncomfortable until you get a chance to express yourself and react to what I have to say. It's a very controversial topic, and I will tell you what I think very candidly. I have distributed a sheet. If you didn't get the copy, I think there are some in the audience there. They're on the table outside. And also, I've given to Ron a copy of 3 things that I'm leaving here. 2 of them are publications of mine, and I'll make reference to them. Well, they're on the sheet that you have, where it says Robert Ashmore's publications there in the middle. They are issues of link, and you can have your own copy by going to afeu.org, and you can access and download those publications. So once again, thank you. Yeah, here comes some extra copies of that one page. You will notice at the top of it, it says resources, Jewish historians and writers. And I do that for a very specific reason, of course. What I want to point out to you in doing that is that I'm not relying here for citing all of those authors are Jewish scholars and historians and writers. And so, I urge you to do your own homework after listening to me and interacting with me. And I challenge you, just read one of these. Ian Lustig is at the very top of that list. University of Texas Press is now at the University of Pennsylvania. Or Sarah Shearer Robinson, that's a fairly new book, Stanford University Press, Aborigine Trading. I'll talk more about these later, but let me get started here. I want to begin by explaining that my commitment is to a single universal standard that should govern both legal and moral discourse. This is the filter for me. And each of you comes this evening with your own filters. And those filters can be helpful or they can be hurtful. That is to say, the filter that you bring to your experiences can prevent facts and scientific evidence and contrary arguments from having an impact. Or your filter can help you to listen and to consider reflectively contrary arguments. So for me, the filter is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations on December 10, 1948. I created a course at Marquette, where I've been since 1969. I created a course in human rights, taught it both at the philosophy department and in the honors program at Marquette. That Universal Declaration of Human Rights was subsequently elaborated in two covenants adopted by the United Nations in 1966. They are now part of international law. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The United States is a signatory. And it's sadly the case, while there is worldwide lip service paid to these human rights, there's also worldwide violation of these rights. Rights include prohibitions on torture, on slavery, on servitude, on racial and gender discrimination. They include the right of return, of freedom of movement, and equal pay for equal work. The foundational claim is that all humans are equal in dignity and rights. Now that may sound very familiar to you. And proud as I am to be an American, I'm painfully aware of how lacking is my own country's record in this regard. The Declaration of Independence itself was composed by a slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson. And while it declares it self-evident that all men are created equal with inalienable rights, that clearly did not apply to the Native American Indians, whom Jefferson in the document called merciless savages. Nor did the equality claim apply to blacks, to women, or to people without specific property qualifications. Subsequent history of the United States finds us confiscating land by extermination of the native dwellers, confiscating land by provoking a war with Mexico, confiscating confiscating land by provoking a war with Spain, and continuing to this day to extend our international reach through military and economic power. A standard 2-volume history of U.S. foreign relations by Thomas Patterson, and now a colleague of mine at Marquette, is one of the writers and editors. It has its first chapter titled, Embryo of Empire. In saying this now, I am not ignoring the faults of others. I'm mindful of family resemblances among all empires in history, including the British and the Spanish and the French. I'm sitting in right now, of course, at Marquette, the history of Latin America, and in the discussion period, I can maybe talk about some of that gory history. But might does not make right, at least moral. And so what's our responsibility? First of all, not to contribute to and enable the continuation of injustices. And it's to try as much as we can to compensate, redress, and restore where injustice has been done. That's a summons to action. Now, intelligent, effective action requires confronting honestly the facts. Resist psychological defense mechanisms. Viewing oneself as a citizen of the world, not a narrowly nationalistic, chauvinistic, xenophobic perspective, but viewing oneself as a citizen of the world. Martin Luther King once said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Now, there's a price to pay for remaining silent. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. There's a price to pay for not remaining silent. King paid it. Gandhi paid it. Jesus paid it. But from the moral point of view, there's a much greater price that one pays for wearing blinders, for simply moving with the herd, for looking the other way when injustices are done in one's name, with one's tax dollars, and often with one's own boots on the ground. King, again, said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. A philosopher, Cornel West, said recently, we need more fire in our world. People on fire for justice. Well, the purpose of my talk this evening is hopefully to fire us up for justice. My special focus is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A special focus because our country, the United States, stands alone in its support for what Israel is doing and has been doing for a long time in violation of Palestinian human rights. I say stand alone because it's the United States alone that casts a negative vote in the Security Council, blocking an otherwise unanimous vote against Israeli action. And it's often the United States and Israel voting alone in the General Assembly of the UN against most of the nations of the world. Added to this is the foreign aid given each year to Israel, exceeding that of all other nations. In Israel's recent war against Gaza, the third in 6 years, Obama was replenishing Israel's After all, 1.8 million people, Palestinians, are in a space, imagine this, 1.8 million people in a space 4 miles wide and 28 miles long, under siege in an open-air prison from which Israel blocks exit by land or by air or by sea. I'm a member of Amnesty International, and it's listed on your sheet. Here's a report from Amnesty International in November about that war. The Israeli forces displayed callous indifference in deadly attacks on family homes in Gaza. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, there's an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, they're all listed. You can go to them. See, I'm saying you don't have to take my word for it. I want you to do your own critical thinking. In October of 2014, the New York Times editorialized saying, what's the point of raising and spending many millions of dollars to rebuild the Gaza Strip just so it can be destroyed the next war? It's a harsh question. Given the region's history, it is also inevitable. The New York Times. That is why tonight I want to focus on the root cause of this conflict. See, people don't, with their filters, people do not want to be challenged to ask, what are the causes of this? People prefer to deal with the symptoms, but not ask the causes. Pro-Israelis refuse to face it, but without justice addressing the root cause, chatter about peace is worthless distraction. In this country, to criticize Israel is to expose oneself immediately to charges of being anti-Semitic, of forgetting the Holocaust, of defending terrorists, and if you're Jewish, of being self-hating. So I want to address some issues immediately, very candidly with you. In criticizing injustices committed by Israel with U.S. support, I want to tell you right away, there is no Arab regime that I defend. I've got a single standard, I told you. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its subsequent elaborations. Measured by that standard, there is no Arab regime that I can defend. Arab leaders have ill-served their peoples for a very long time. What moral grade, for example, can one give Gaddafi in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Assad in Syria, Mubarak in Egypt, the Emir of Kuwait, the King of Saudi Arabia? But it seems to me, if nothing else, we should be concerned about what our own nation is doing in this region. With regard to anti-Semitism, which paralyzes people with enough fear that they don't speak out. Of course, one must condemn attacks on persons based on their ethnicity. However, the label of anti-Semite should not be automatically applied to silence criticism of Israeli action, as it often is. And it must be borne in mind that Arabs are Semites. Indeed, far more numerously Semites than Jews. In fact, many Jews are not Semites. And many Jews, including the founders of Israel, are not religious. They're secular Jews. But then they said, He, God, gave us the land. Now you think about that. Regarding the other anti-Semitism, that directed at Arabs, I must say the most virulent anti-Semitism I've ever personally witnessed was in my many trips to Israel-Palestine, witnessing the treatment of Palestinians by Israeli Jews. And in the discussion period, I can offer examples of that. I can say, without dwelling on it, my own commitment to Palestinian human rights has provoked attempts to have me fired at Marquette University, has provoked attempts at blackmail, threats of physical harm that my wife doesn't even know about. Why should I get her upset? Things when I ran for public office. Lastly, the complaint that Israel's recent war on Gaza has resulted in upsurge of anti-Semitism prompts the question, well, is some anti-Semitism self-inflicted? That is, can it be unexpected if Israeli war crimes contribute to such reaction? Now the Holocaust. Take all the bulls by the horn here. On the Holocaust, I join all fair-minded people in deploring the catastrophe that befell Jews at the hands of Hitler and the Nazis. That's not to say, however, that Jews have a monopoly on victimhood. We must bear in mind that Holocausts have also been suffered by Cambodians, by Armenians, by Native Americans, by African Americans, by Irish at the hands of the British, by Darfur people at the hands of the government of Sudan, and by Palestinians, whose own Nakba or Holocaust continues to this day. Yasser Arafat once said to me, I met with him in Amman, Jordan one time, also met with him in Tunis. Arafat said to me, we Palestinians have no intention of ending up like American Indians. Never again applies to all victims of oppression. And as with the charge of anti-Semitism, no one should invoke the Holocaust to silence justified criticism of Israeli actions. That misuse of Holocaust rhetoric is precisely the complaint in a book by Jewish scholar Norman Finkelstein, it's listed among your Jewish sources there, titled The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. That from a person whose parents were survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto, and who virtually the entire family of whom on both sides was exterminated by the Nazis. In fact, at Marquette, I spoke just about 3 weeks ago with a Holocaust survivor, Hetty Epstein. She's over 90 years old now. Both her parents were exterminated by the Nazis. And there she was, sitting beside me, defending the Palestinians. And she was asked, well, shouldn't there be a place in the world where the Jews can have a state of their own? And you know what her reply was? One sentence reply. She said, yes, but not at the expense of other people. On one of my trips to Israel-Palestine, I recall visiting the mayor of Al-Bilo in the West Bank, who was the object of a Jewish terrorist assassination attempt. Tawil was his name. He told me he constantly heard the Holocaust invoked by Jewish settlers to justify themselves. I also visited the other two mayors, Palestinian mayors, one in Nablus and one in Jericho, who had their legs blown off. The same day as Tawil was being targeted. Jewish terrorists. And so that brings me to the next label, terrorist. Every other sentence from the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, is a reference to Palestinian terrorists. Do we remember that Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist? And his ANC was called a terrorist organization? We certainly know that Palestinians resisting Israel are unfailingly labeled as terrorists. Now let's back up a minute and ask how terrorism is defined. And I've got a publication on that. It's on your sheet under Robert Ashmore. State terrorism and its sponsors. My dictionary defines it as a mode of governing or opposing government by intimidation. In other words, folks, governments can be terrorists, not just insurgents. Terrorism can be from above as well as from below, by governments as well as by those resisting government. In fact, the word originated with the reign of terror the government created during the French Revolution. In history, the great majority of victims of terrorism have been victims of state-sponsored terrorism. We know this. Think of Pol Pot in Cambodia, of Mobutu in Zaire, Mao in China, Stalin in Russia, Hitler in Germany, of the Kims in North Korea. History tells us that insurgent terrorism, terrorism from below, is usually a reaction to state terrorism. Please don't let your filter prevent you from hearing this. Insurgent terrorism is usually a reaction to state terrorism. And most of the victims of terrorism in history are the victims of governments, not of insurgent groups. Now, where am I going with this? I maintain that it is Israeli state terrorism practiced from day one in confiscation of land and oppression of the Palestinian people that accounts for the insurgent violence committed by Palestinians from below. That's tough language. And I want to hear from you in the discussion period. But I'm going to chronicle that history. People under occupation have the right to armed resistance against violent occupiers. That's international law. Now, does that mean that innocent civilians are a fair target? No. But that no raises another question. Who are innocent civilians?